I still remember vividly the moment I stood in the courtroom that day. It was the day my younger brother Julian placed his hand on the oath and looked me straight in the eye before uttering words that would completely alter the course of my life. He claimed I was a dangerous father, that he had witnessed firsthand how I kept my wife and children living in fear, and in a matter of seconds, the entire room turned to look at me, as if they had already decided I was the guilty party. Eleanor sat behind Julian, her head quietly bowed like a woman who had endured years of a miserable marriage. My parents, too, chose to side with the youngest son, the one they had always protected, the one they believed needed the most sheltering. But none of them knew that what Julian said in court wasn't the truth. They saw only the story they had been told, a story in which I was a terrible husband, a callous father, a man unworthy of his own family. They thought I had lost everything. They thought that by casting me as the villain, they could strip away everything I had spent a lifetime building. My assets, my reputation, and even the right to be with my 2 children. But they had forgotten one thing. I am not a man who acts out of anger. I do not destroy everything simply because I have been hurt. I am an architect. I have spent my entire life building structures meant to stand the test of time. And I understand that for a building to remain standing, it requires more than just a beautiful facade. It needs a solid foundation. The same applies to this battle. I have built a foundation of my own, a foundation built upon the truth. But before that day arrived, before my only younger brother stood against me in court, and before the woman I once loved most turned her back on me, I used to think I was the luckiest man alive. I had a career I was proud of. I had a home I built for my family. And I had 2 children I was willing to sacrifice everything to protect. It never crossed my mind that the force capable of shattering my life would come not from a stranger, but from the very people I trusted most. My name is Marcus Walker, and this is the story of how a seemingly perfect family was destroyed by greed, lies, and betrayal. Before everything turned into a war between people who once called each other family, my life was very different. I am not a man who craves the spotlight. I was never the type to walk into a room wanting every eye on me. I have always believed that a person's worth isn't measured by how much they talk about themselves, but by what they quietly build when no one is watching. I am Marcus Walker, an architect who has spent most of his life building things from scratch. I run my own design consultancy with a solid team and a career I spent years establishing. But looking back, what I'm proudest of has never been the buildings I designed or the contracts I signed. What I'm proudest of is becoming a man who takes full responsibility for his own life. I grew up believing that success built on luck alone never lasts. Everything requires a solid foundation, just like a building. If the foundation is weak, no matter how beautiful the exterior, it will eventually collapse. That is the principle I apply to my work. It is also the principle I apply to my life. But my younger brother, Julian, grew up with a completely different perspective. Julian is 6 years my junior, and from a young age, he was always the special child in my parents' eyes. He had a gift for art, a vivid imagination, and a way of speaking that easily captivated others. My parents always believed that Julian was born to do something great. People often say that he isn't like ordinary people, that an artistic soul needs freedom and support, and shouldn't be constrained by conventional molds. I never opposed Julian's pursuit of art. In fact, I was once his biggest supporter. When Julian decided to become a freelance artist, even though I knew the path was unstable, I believed that with seriousness and effort, he could find his own success. But over time, I began to realize there is a vast difference between pursuing a passion and using that passion as an excuse to evade responsibility. While I spent years building a company, paying employees, and ensuring a stable life, Julian continued to rely on financial support from our parents. Whenever he faced difficulties, my family dismissed it as merely a temporary phase. Whenever I offered a critique, they would say I was too pragmatic, too dry, and failed to understand how an artist ought to be treated. I don't resent Julian for that. What hurts me is how people always judge the two of us by different standards. My successes are often taken for granted. Yet, every small step Julian takes is hailed as a sign of great talent waiting for the world's recognition. And then, Eleanor entered my life. If Julian is someone driven by emotion and external validation, Eleanor is a completely different kind of person. She works in the arts, possesses a refined aesthetic sense, and is always drawn to things that are distinctive, unique, and profound. When we met, I was captivated by her intelligence and her perspective on the world. Eleanor is unlike any woman I have ever met. She had her own thoughts, her own standards, and a firm belief that life was about more than just earning money and building stability. At first, I thought our differences were what made the marriage interesting. I was a pragmatist. She was driven by emotion. I focused on long-term plans. She valued experiences and emotional fulfillment. I used to think those differences would complement each other. I thought I needed someone like Eleanor to make my life less rigid, and she thought I was someone who could provide a secure foundation for her to pursue the things she loved. In those early years, we were truly happy. But I failed to realize that differences can turn into a chasm if two people are no longer looking in the same direction. I wanted to build a stable future. Eleanor, however, began to crave a life belonging to a different world, a world of high-level connections, exclusive clubs, and people she viewed as the elite. That was when the small differences between us began to turn into the first cracks. I just didn't know then that those cracks would eventually become the point where everything fell apart. Looking back, I realized that betrayal rarely begins with a dramatic moment. It doesn't arrive with a heated argument or a sudden decision. It starts with tiny changes, things that, viewed in isolation, seem too trivial to worry about. But as those small things began to accumulate, I sensed that something in our family was shifting. Eleanor began to view our life through a different lens. She was no longer satisfied with the stability I had, once thought we both desired. The house I took such pride in building with my own hard work now seemed all too ordinary in her eyes. Simple family vacations, plans to save for the future, and my cautious financial decisions began to be viewed as signs of a lack of ambition. Eleanor often said that I was too focused on the numbers, forgetting the value of experiences. She told me I was a good builder, but that I didn't know how to enjoy life. At first, I tried to listen. I thought perhaps I had focused too heavily on my responsibilities and neglected other aspects of life. I tried to change, to participate more in the events Eleanor cared about, and to understand the art world she constantly spoke of. But the problem wasn't a lack of effort on my part. The problem was that Eleanor seemed to have no interest in finding common ground with me anymore. She became increasingly focused on the elite circles she admired. Meetings with collectors, exclusive art events, and conversations about people she deemed socially prominent became a major part of her life. I didn't object to that. I never wanted to control my wife. I believe that in a marriage, both partners need their own space for personal growth. What unsettled me, however, was that Eleanor no longer viewed my values with the same respect she once had. She started labeling me as overly pragmatic. She claimed I failed to grasp the deeper nuances of life. At times, she would look at how I managed our finances and accuse me of causing our family to miss out on opportunities to enter a more refined world. This was especially true regarding Leo and Violet. Eleanor wanted the children exposed to environments she believed would broaden their horizons. She wanted to enroll them in expensive art clubs, programs for upper-class families, and activities with costs far exceeding what I considered reasonable. I wasn't opposed to investing in our children. On the contrary, that had always been my top priority. But I wanted those investments to truly serve our children's future, not just allow us to claim membership in a certain social circle. And every time I tried to explain that, Eleanor accused me of holding the children back. She said I was too rigid, too calculating. too much like someone who only knows how to build walls, never how to open a door and step outside. Little did I know that while I was trying to preserve the unique dynamic between us, Eleanor was seeking connection with someone else. And that someone was the last person I ever thought I needed to guard against, Julian. My younger brother began appearing in our lives more frequently. At first, I saw nothing unusual about it. Julian had always been close to Eleanor, bonded by their shared love of art. They could talk for hours about paintings, exhibitions, emerging artists, or creative concepts that sometimes went right over my head. I used to think that was a good thing. I was glad my wife had someone in the family to share the interests I wasn't well versed in. I even encouraged Julian to come over more often. I told him he could use my home office if he needed a quiet space to work. I trusted him enough to open the very door I should have kept closed. But I came to realize later that placing trust in the wrong person isn't an act of kindness. It is a vulnerability that others can exploit. Julian started showing up more often, claiming he was looking for inspiration for new pieces. He said my office had great light, the right atmosphere for thinking, and helped him focus. I didn't suspect a thing, because he was my brother, and Eleanor was my wife. The two people whom, out of everyone in the world, I believed would be the last to hurt me. But there were signs I overlooked at the time. Conversations would cease the moment I entered the room. Messages on Eleanor's screen would vanish quickly whenever I approached. Julian would linger longer than usual, with no clear reason for doing so. I saw it all, but I refused to believe what my intuition was trying to tell me. Because sometimes, the hardest thing to accept isn't discovering that a stranger is betraying you. It is realizing that the people you love most are capable of doing the same. I kept trying to convince myself that I was just overthinking things. I kept trying to believe that Eleanor was simply going through a phase of change. I kept trying to believe that Julian was just a younger brother in need of support. Until the day I saw the truth, a truth that no husband and no brother ever wants to witness. And that moment completely changed the way I viewed the two people I had trusted most. There are truths in life that, even if you've suspected them or braced yourself for the worst, you are never truly prepared to face when you see them with your own eyes. For me, that truth didn't come from a confession or a frank conversation between adults. It came from a computer screen in the room I had always considered my sanctuary. The studio, at the back of the house, had always held a special significance for me. It wasn't just a workspace. It was where I had spent thousands of hours building my career. The drawings scattered across the desk were more than just sheets of paper. They represented years of experience, countless sleepless nights, and decisions that could shape the future of the company. I had always thought that room held nothing but architectural concepts, construction plans, and the dreams I hoped to bring to life. I never imagined that the very place where I worked would become the setting where I discovered the collapse of my family. Years ago, due to the nature of my work, I installed a security camera system in my studio. It didn't stem from any suspicion toward anyone in my household. I was simply a cautious person. My work involved critical blueprints, unreleased projects, and documents that could have disastrous consequences if leaked. I needed to ensure that everything I built was protected, but life has a cruel irony. Sometimes, the very things we create to safeguard our assets end up exposing the truth about the people we love. That day, I received a notification from the system indicating movement in the studio, at a time when I hadn't expected Eleanor or Julian to be using the room. At first, I didn't think it was anything serious. I told myself that perhaps Eleanor had gone in to grab some documents, or Julian needed the space to finish a piece of work. I kept trying to find a logical explanation, perhaps because, deep down, people rarely want to believe in the very thing that would cause them the most pain. I played the recording, and just seconds later, any hope that I had misunderstood the situation vanished. I saw Eleanor walk into my studio. Then Julian followed. There was no discussion about art, There was no creative project like the ones they had told me about. There was no innocent reason that could explain their presence there. I saw my wife and my younger brother together, right there in my room, right on the desk where I sat working every day. In that moment, I didn't feel the rage I had always imagined I would. I didn't smash the screen, rush downstairs to confront them, or scream, demanding to know how they could do this to me. I simply sat there, because sometimes the greatest betrayals don't trigger immediate anger. Instead, they leave you silent, as the mind needs time to accept that the things you once believed in no longer exist. I spent years building a family founded on trust. I believed Eleanor was the woman who would walk through life's hardships by my side. I believed Julian, despite our differences, was a younger brother who still cared for me. It never crossed my mind that the two of them would join forces to destroy everything I had fought so hard to protect. But I understood one thing: anger wouldn't help me win this battle. As an architect, I know that a structure meant to last cannot be built in haste. A skilled builder doesn't tear everything down the moment a problem arises. They inspect the structure, identify the cause, gather data, and ensure that when they act, they leave no weak points behind. So, I decided to do the same. I didn't tell Eleanor I knew. I didn't call Julian to ask why he had betrayed me. I let them go on believing their secret was safe. Meanwhile, I began to investigate everything. I reviewed family accounts, payments, and transactions I'd previously had no reason to question. I had always trusted Eleanor to manage part of the household finances. It was simply what couples did. But the closer I looked, the more irregularities I found. There were withdrawals made under the guise of Julian's art projects. There were payments for lavish dinners, high-end hotels, and trips I knew nothing about. What hurt the most was realizing that some of that money came from the fund I had set aside for my children's future. That was when I understood. This was no longer just a story about an affair. This was a story about exploitation. Eleanor and Julian hadn't just been hiding an illicit relationship from me. They were building a life upon my sacrifices and the trust I had placed in them. But instead of confronting them immediately, I continued to observe. I wanted to know what they were planning next. I wanted to know if this was merely a momentary betrayal, or if there was a larger scheme at play. And I soon realized that what I had uncovered was only the beginning of the truth. Because when someone is willing to betray their own family, they rarely stop at a single lie. They spin further lies to protect the original one. And this time, they weren't just betraying me. They were preparing to drag me into a battle they believed I couldn't win. After discovering the truth about Eleanor and Julian, I knew my marriage was beyond saving. Yet, what pained me most wasn't losing a wife, nor was it realizing my own brother had betrayed me. What terrified me most was the prospect of them taking those lies to court and casting me as the villain in a story where I was the victim. And that is exactly what they did. I did not act out of anger. I didn't use the videos I possessed to humiliate Eleanor or Julian in front of the family. I didn't call my parents to demand why they had allowed someone like Julian to hurt me. I understood that if I wanted to protect myself, my reputation, and, most importantly, my right to be with Leo and Violet, I had to proceed with a cool head. I began working with my lawyer, Patricia Chen, a renowned figure in family law. From our very first meeting, she told me something I would never forget. She told me that in complex divorce cases, the truth doesn't always prevail immediately. The winner is usually the person who can prove the truth most convincingly, and that was what I needed to do. I handed everything I had over to Patricia. Surveillance footage, financial statements, transaction histories, messages between Eleanor and Julian, and information revealing how long they had kept their relationship hidden. But Patricia didn't rush to use it all. She explained that strong evidence isn't simply what makes the other party angry. Strong evidence is what leaves the opposing side with absolutely no way to deny the facts. So, we continued to scrutinize every detail. We discovered that Eleanor hadn't just hidden her relationship with Julian from me. She had also been using money from our family accounts to fund the life she was trying to build with him. Expenses were logged under the guise of art projects, exhibitions, or activities related to Julian's creative work, but upon closer inspection, many of them served no such purpose at all. Dinners at high-end restaurants, hotel bookings, payments for trips I knew nothing about. All of this gradually painted a clear picture of how they had been living. But I never expected their betrayal to go even further. When I officially filed for divorce, Eleanor didn't choose to admit her wrongdoing. She didn't apologize for what had happened. Instead, she chose to fight back with a completely different narrative. In her court filings, Eleanor portrayed me as a cold, controlling husband who was indifferent to his family's feelings. She claimed I was obsessed with work, that I always prioritized my designs and the company over my wife and children. Worse still, she accused me of creating an environment that made her and the children feel pressured. I could hardly believe what I was reading, because I know I'm not a perfect person. I used to work too much. There were times I didn't spend enough time with my family. But I was never the man Eleanor was trying to paint me as in court. I never hurt her. I never made my children afraid. And then came the ultimate betrayal. Julian sided with Eleanor, the younger brother I had helped, who had lived under my roof, who had called me the brother he always admired. He was now testifying against me. During his testimony, Julian swore an oath, declaring that what he was about to say was the truth, but what he said next wasn't the truth. He told the court he had witnessed me losing my temper with Eleanor. He claimed I constantly pressured my wife, that I was an overly rigid father who kept my children living in fear. Julian spoke about me as if he had lived in our home, as if he had witnessed every moment of my marriage. But he didn't tell the court that, during that same time, he was secretly involved with Eleanor. He didn't mention that he had a vested interest in making me look like the villain. And what hurt the most was that my parents also chose to side with Julian. They said I was ruining my younger brother's future. They said that no matter what happened, I was the older brother and needed to be forgiving. They wanted me to overlook everything, simply for the sake of family. But they didn't understand that family isn't built on blood ties alone. A family is built on loyalty, respect, and truth. Yet, at that moment, the very people who shared my blood were the ones trying to take everything from me. However, they made a mistake. They thought my silence meant weakness. They thought that, because I didn't react with anger, I had no way to fight back. But they didn't realize that all this time, I wasn't preparing for revenge. I was preparing for the truth to speak for itself, and the day Julian had to face his own lies in court was drawing near. I used to think the most painful moment of my life was catching Eleanor, and Julian betraying me in my own study. But later, I realized the greatest pain lay not in the betrayal itself, but in watching the people who had hurt me try to cast themselves as victims while painting me as the villain. Eleanor and Julian had prepared meticulously for this battle. They didn't just want to end my marriage. They wanted to control the narrative that followed. They wanted the court to see a cold husband, an indifferent father, and a man unworthy of custody of his children. And to achieve that, they needed a witness, Julian. In the lead-up to the hearing, Julian remained confident that his words would be convincing enough. He had told Eleanor's lawyer that he could prove exactly what kind of man I was, claiming that, as my younger brother who had been close to my family, he understood the whole situation. But Julian had overlooked one crucial detail. He wasn't the one who truly understood the situation. He was merely someone who thought he could fabricate a story that no one would verify. On the stand, Julian swore his oath and insisted that everything he said was the truth. He claimed I frequently lost control, subjected Eleanor to constant pressure, and had committed acts that terrified my wife and children. Had I heard those words a few years earlier, the pain might have left me unable to react. After all, he was my younger brother, the brother I had helped, the brother I had welcomed into my home. But in that moment, I simply sat in silence, because I knew the truth lay behind it all. And Patricia Chen, my lawyer, knew that too. She didn't rush to produce the video capturing Eleanor and Julian's affair. She didn't immediately bring up the unusual sums of money Eleanor had spent. She understood that to defeat a big lie, sometimes you have to let the liar build their own trap. Patricia began by asking Julian to reaffirm each of his previous statements. She asked if he was certain he had personally witnessed the events he described. Julian replied that he was certain. She asked if he remembered the exact time, place, and circumstances of those events. Julian insisted that he remembered them clearly. And that was when Patricia began presenting the evidence we had prepared. The first piece of evidence was my work schedule. For the day, Julian claimed I had acted violently toward Eleanor. According to Julian's testimony, he had been at my house that day and witnessed the entire incident in the living room. But my records told a completely different story. That day, I was in another state attending a National Architecture Awards ceremony. Not only was I there, but my presence was documented by multiple independent sources: photos from the organizers, event footage, guest lists, and interviews conducted that very day. The geographical distance made Julian's testimony implausible. He couldn't have witnessed an incident in my home while I was making a public appearance hundreds of miles away. But that was just the beginning. Patricia proceeded to present further evidence. She laid out my travel history for the days Julian claimed I had neglected my family. The data shows that at many of those times, I was engaged in activities with Leo and Violet, ranging from school performances and family trips to the very events Eleanor had accused me of being indifferent toward. She then presented images with timestamps and location data retrieved from my phone. The photos I once thought were merely ordinary snapshots of a father's life now served as proof that Julian's story was completely false. I am not a perfect father. I know I spent too much time on work. I know there were times I couldn't be everywhere at once. But I never abandoned my children, and the evidence proved it. As Patricia cross-referenced each of Julian's statements with the facts, the mood in the courtroom shifted. Those who had once looked at me with suspicion began to realize they had heard only one side of the story. But what truly caused Julian to crumble wasn't just that some of his claims were proven false. It was that Patricia exposed the motive behind those lies. She presented evidence of the relationship between Julian and Eleanor: text messages spanning months, calls made at odd hours, financial transactions involving funds from the family account, everything they thought they had kept hidden. At the same time, financial records revealed that Eleanor had used family money to bankroll Julian's activities, including expenses unrelated to any legitimate art project. The full picture finally emerged. Julian wasn't a brother standing up for the truth. He had a vested interest in my downfall. He hadn't testified to protect Eleanor. He testified to protect the very life he was trying to build through betrayal. After the trial, I decided not to stop at merely proving Julian had lied. I demanded that the authorities investigate him for perjury, because there are lies that can be forgiven within a family. But a lie told under oath in court is no longer a personal matter. It is an assault on the truth. In the end, Julian had to answer for his actions. He received an 18-month suspended sentence, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent criminal record. For someone who had always craved recognition from the art world and the institutions he once aspired to join, the consequences were devastating. But perhaps the moment that stays with me forever isn't when the judge read out the sentence. It was the few minutes afterward, when Julian found me in the hallway outside the courtroom. For the first time in years, I saw the arrogance in his eyes vanish completely. He was no longer the younger brother who believed he would always be forgiven. No longer the artist who thought talent and smooth talk could shield him from every consequence. There was only a desperate man. "Marcus, please, you're my brother. You know I was wrong. Can you drop the charges? Can you tell them I just made a mistake?" He grabbed my hand. He said he hadn't thought things would go this far. He said Eleanor had made him believe it was all just a plan to reclaim what he deserved. He said he was still my family. But I just looked at him and remembered everything that had happened. I remembered the moment he stood in court and used our brotherhood against me. I remembered the way he looked me straight in the eye and told lies. I remembered that if his plan had succeeded, I wouldn't have just lost my assets. I could lose the right to be with Leo and Violet. I told Julian that I forgave him. But I couldn't save him from the consequences of the choices he had made. I didn't refuse because I hated him. I refused because there are lessons one must experience firsthand to truly understand the value of the truth. Julian had plenty of chances to stop. He had the chance to tell the truth when Eleanor began to betray me. He had the chance to walk away from the scheme before stepping into the courtroom. But he chose to lie. And now, he has to live with that choice. Perhaps Julian's greatest punishment isn't the verdict itself. It lies in the fact that everyone finally sees him for who he truly is. A man who could speak beautifully about art, emotion, and creativity, yet was willing to destroy his own brother's family just to get what he wanted. And once every lie was laid bare, I realized my true battle was over, because I never needed to exact revenge on them. I only needed to let the truth do it for me. After the trial ended, I had imagined that moment would bring a sense of victory. I had spent months fighting to prove I wasn't the man Eleanor and Julian had tried to portray to the world. I had defended my honor, fought for the right to be with Leo and Violet, and, most importantly, reclaimed the truth they had tried to bury. But as the dust settled, I realized that some victories don't bring the joy we imagine, because the people on the other side of this conflict weren't strangers. They were the woman who had been my wife, the brother I had once loved, and the family members I thought would always stand by my side. A few weeks after the trial, Julian came to see me. For the first time in years, I saw a man completely different from the brother I used to know. His confidence had vanished, the flowery rhetoric was gone, and in their place stood a man confronting the consequences of his own choices. Julian spoke of his regret and his mistake in trusting Eleanor's promises. He admitted he never imagined things would end this way. He called me his only brother and begged for a chance to set things right. I studied him for a long time, for deep down, a part of me still remembered the younger brother I used to know, the one I had helped through hard times, the one I had welcomed into my home, the one with whom I believed family bonds would remain unshakable, no matter our differences. But there are things in life that, once broken, can never be restored to what they were. I didn't turn Julian away out of a desire for revenge. I refused because forgiveness does not mean allowing someone to walk back into your life as if nothing had happened. I could understand why he had gone astray, but I could not erase his actions. He hadn't merely lied about me. He had gambled with my future, my reputation, and my relationship with my children, all for his own gain. I told Julian I hoped he would truly change one day, not to prove anything to me or anyone else, but so he could live at peace with himself. Yet, I also told him that there are doors which, once closed by one's own hand, cannot simply be opened again at will by others. That was a lesson Julian had to learn for himself. As for Eleanor, she too would have to face a new reality following the choices she had made. The woman who once believed she could control the narrative, who thought that simply painting me as a terrible husband would secure her everything, has ultimately been forced to live with the reality that the life she built was founded on betrayal. I no longer spend my time hating Eleanor. I've realized that anger only keeps me tethered to the people who hurt me. All I want now is to protect the new life I have with my children. Leo and Violet don't need to grow up harboring hatred. They shouldn't have to carry the emotional scars inflicted by the adults in their lives. What I want them to remember isn't the conflict between their parents, but the fact that they were always loved, always had a safe place to come home to, and always had a father ready to stand by their side. So, I decided to leave my old city and start over. I built a new life, a new home, and a new future with my children. That house wasn't the grandest structure I had ever designed, nor was it something that would draw the admiration of others. Yet, to me, It held more meaning than any building I had ever created. It was a place free from lies, betrayal, and people who only stayed by my side when they needed something from me. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that life sometimes takes away the very people we thought we couldn't afford to lose. Yet, that loss can also reveal truths we had previously chosen to ignore. I used to believe that an architect's greatest success lay in constructing buildings meant to endure for centuries. But after this ordeal, I came to realize that the most important structure one can build is not a physical edifice, but rather one's character, trust, and relationships forged through sincerity. After all, a house may be beautiful, yet it can still collapse if its foundation has rotted away. A family is no different. It is sustained not merely by blood ties or promises, but by honesty, respect, and the way we treat one another when no one is watching.